Call this meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to the March 14th meeting of the Douglas County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. My name is Pam Weegan and I'm the chair of the CJCC. This will be a hybrid meeting. So I'm going to go over our Zoom guidelines for those who are meeting with us on Zoom. We ask that all members on Zoom, please turn on video if you have it. We ask that all members on Zoom mute their line when not speaking. We ask that you please identify yourself each time you speak. If you are on Zoom and have public comment to make during the public comment section of the agenda, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. Recordings of the CJCC meetings are available on the CJCC website after each meeting. Our first agenda item today is the 2023 and 2024 CJCC work plan discussion with the CJCC coordinator, Katie Fitzgerald. Go ahead, Katie.
Thank you, Pam. I know. Can y'all hear me here? Okay. I know we have a couple folks who are having to join remotely. So this is meant as a continuation from last month. So last month we had talked about I presented kind of a combination of lots of sources of information to pull together ideas for how we might move forward in 2023 and 2024 with the CJCC. And so this is continuation of that conversation and ideally to help us put together some more tangible kind of next steps and work groups and things. So okay, I got it to work. So I will make a mess. I'm gonna try. I'm not near as nervous this month, so I don't know if that might, I'm not sure how that's gonna bode. Okay, so wait, how do I do? Hold on then. Okay. So today I was going to do a brief review of the topics that we presented and talked a little bit about in February. And then I had sent out last week a very large document to folks that I don't know how many of y'all have had time to read. It was a lot of information. And so I've tried to condense that to kind of talk through today. And then I wanted to get feedback about potential ideas for the May agenda for our next meeting. So just as a highlight or overview of what we talked about last month, there were topics, the way that I had broken those out in the last month's meeting, that first group of ideas or things that fall really in the primary purview of CJCC members and agencies that are represented here. So these were things like we've talked a lot about how to regularly review the jail process, the jail population, failure to appear and probation violations were some really large populations that came out of Vera's report and data in their evaluation for us. Competency restoration and pretrial defendants. So those were kind of the large topics in that area that we discussed. Beyond the justice system, so those topics that kind of involve other folks, not necessarily just limited to the folks sitting at this table, but opportunities, taking advantage of opportunities to align with existing community efforts, continuing to support the initiatives at the intersection of behavioral health and criminal justice, building out data, reporting and monitoring, and then the bylaws and infrastructure of CJCC really is within CJCC's purview, but was not as much, it's different than those, a little different than what was in that first group. And then the work that we would be continuing that CJCC has already started and has been maintaining for the last several years, addressing racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system, and continuing to evaluate programs and services that fall under CJCC member agencies. And then also we talked briefly about building that out to encompass community partner agreements and service agreements that align or touch the justice involved population as well. So building on that, what I took those ideas and that document that I had sent out that kind of takes those, and I was trying to put together suggestions for what I would suggest, places that would be easiest, I think, to gain traction and to pull folks together around work groups. So that document that I sent out, if you've had a chance to work through it, really focuses on failure to appear and probation violation responses. So I will kind of walk through what that document was a little bit today. And as I said in my email last week, I think this is a starting point. It's open for discussion and feedback. And I was trying to put as much information kind of out there as possible, as opportunities or things to consider, and then kind of see where that takes us. So all of these are up for debate and discussion, and I would encourage that. And also recognize that as I've thought about potential work group members or potential topics, potential actions or things to for us to consider, that there may be things missing. So I would encourage you all to share that as you see them. So the first topic that I tackled in that group, so these are in a little different order, was failure to appear. I think there's, as I had mentioned last month, there's kind of two approaches a lot of times when jurisdictions look at addressing failure to appear rates. There's an approach that looks at how do we maximize information that's made available, how do we help defendants and also victims and witnesses get information and overcome barriers as much as possible to attend court. And then the separate approach, which is the next couple slides, is the more court-led and kind of court-specific responses to failures to appear. So I think there's a potential that kind of 3 work groups come out of failure to appear. The first work group is this more broad information, access to information, exploring strategies to overcome barriers to court appearance. In this particular topic, there has been a lot of work done. I've shared this, I think a lot of times. I know I've talked about this resource. The School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has done a fairly extensive project with several different sized jurisdictions across the state of North Carolina, and developed kind of a plug and play list of policies, changes, practice changes, things like that, that jurisdictions can use as kind of ready-made templates. And I think that information was really helpful. And this particular thing here, this is an example of one of the palm cards that they developed. But potentially what some of the things that I think could come out of this group, thinking about how do we, and I know there has been some work with county IT around court notification, and automated court notification reminder system. And then how can we making sure that we can maximize the use of that, making sure that, like, these palm cards, they had lots of different examples that were developed, potential opportunities for defendants to initiate rescheduling of their court dates, if that's an option. What I really liked about this example of this palm card was it gives it on one piece of paper, or on one, it's like a business size card. It gives like how to find your, like, here's how to find your court date on your ticket or your summons. The consequences, a reminder of the consequences. Here, this is, anyways, in that top left corner, because my mouse is being weird. A reminder of the consequences of missing court, which has been an important component in a lot of research about how to improve court appearance. contact information, if you have questions. If we have QR codes, which I'm not sure if we do, but if we did, to access court scheduling, or access dockets, there's that. Some of these jurisdictions had worked on ride sharing opportunities. And so that's what this opportunity here was, is if you needed transportation. And then for certain cases that you can address online, a reminder of where that information is. So there's a lot of examples like that came out of, that have been developed by a lot of other jurisdictions that I think could help serve as a starting point for this particular group to explore how we could take some of that work and customize it to what's available in Douglas County. Potential members that I would off the top of my head kind of think about, I think our self-help center, as it works to come online, could be an important part of that, particularly as they're open. I think that folks coming in and out of the courthouse may be popping in over there for information. And so I think it'd be important to try to engage Brandy and her office if possible. The district attorney's office, I think defense counsel, district court staff, which might be clerks. I'm not sure who that is. I don't know that this necessarily needs to be really high, like the really high level decision makers, but potentially more the staff that's pulling together information around court dates. CJS, thinking about the different pretrial caseloads and utilizing that IT system that the county has. The same with municipal court staff. There may be opportunities here to build out resources that we may have available at district court, but that for municipal courts we don't have. Potentially court services, and then there could be other CJCC members here. I feel like this group might be it feels a little vague, so I feel like there's room for like everybody here, but I think those are some of the key players here when I think about this type of work. I don't know do y'all want me just to kind of go through all of these and y'all chime in as you have questions? And I'm not, what's y'all's preference?
Katie, this is Commissioner Reed. I wonder, there's a couple of different suggested work groups for failure to appear, right? Maybe we can talk about those together and then pause for some feedback about how you've broken those down.
Okay. So this is the first one. The second and third are kind of the same, but one addressing district court, one addressing Lawrence Municipal Court. And I know when we talk, we have the 3 municipal courts, but Lawrence, I think we tend to think the most about Lawrence because it contributes to the majority of our municipal cases. The other approach to failure to appear is thinking about how, from the court perspective, how is it that the court responds to a non-appearance in court? So how do we, what is the kind of threshold that an order for arrest is maybe issued by a judge? When is it appropriate for a notice to appear rather than an order for arrest? Those are very court specific and court driven responses to failure to appear. And so the approach here is kind of 2 work groups, one focusing specifically from the district court process, and then one from the Lawrence Municipal Court approach. Part of this strategy, aside from kind of better understanding and maybe to the extent possible standardizing how we as a jurisdiction agree or feel it's appropriate to respond to failure to appear, are thinking about the alternatives to jail bookings when someone does fail to appear. So are there cases that it's maybe not appropriate in every case that someone needs to be booked into custody when they fail to appear? There's obviously cases where that is an appropriate response. And the other kind of prong to that is, and what we've seen this in Vera's report, and when we've talked about the jail population, another driver of the jail population is length of stay. And so when folks are booked into custody, particularly for failure to appear only, so they don't have additional charges with it. We're not talking about new charges. And by the way, they had a warrant. But for failure to appear only, are there opportunities to reduce those lengths of stay for those individuals that did need to be booked into custody? Membership here, I think, is primarily court actors, but also like I think that's the primary membership for each of these court groups, and then additional support around that. Would be looking to you all to kind of think about who those could be.
Katie, I think that's probably right, but I guess when you start thinking about alternative responses to FTA other than jail bookings and reducing the length of stay, that might involve some of our folks that know a little more about those alternatives.
Mhm.
And so maybe,
Yeah,
Pam's team or court services teams and I don't know as much on the municipal side, what that looks like, should be a part of that
Mhm.
conversation eventually, if not from the beginning.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that those come into play there. I think it's really important here. There's a lot of work here that I think really is initiated and kind of laid out by the courts. And so I don't know that we have folks here from that other than Suzanne, but
Nat, who has been, decided she handles a lot of these, she's at work with court services and community corrections. I think with Susan and Cal, we work with myself, but we meet, we can, and I think we figured out a plan that's working. How can Mike and those people online can hear you? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You have to pull the, yeah, there you go.
There we go.
So this is something that's on our, certainly been on our radar, gosh, for the last, well, a couple years since I've been on board, but so Dee Dee's the ADA who works primarily with community corrections and court services to come up with sort of a streamlined approach, at least from our office. So there's consistency. And I think it's working fairly well. I'll let, I'm speaking for myself, but Pam and Susan and I try to get together at least once a month. We try to set up bi-monthly meetings. Sometimes those happen, sometimes they don't, but I think we stay in pretty good communication with our goals and trying to make sure that we're being fair and trying to do what we can to streamline it, the process, and of course, keep people, hold people accountable, but do the right thing. So, so Dee Dee will be on that. And I want to thank Katie for actually spending some time with me last week, just going through everything that she's talking about today. And I can just say, since I have the mic, that we're on board and we'll have folks appointed who are in the right space, who do this day in and day out and work with all the folks in whatever area to make sure that it's being handled appropriately. So I think that's it. Yeah, so Dee Dee will be appointed to that, and I'm happy to help out and reinforce whatever needs to be done from this perspective.
I would say too, another group that may at some point, depending on how the options kind of considered, another group of folks that could be part of this later potentially is law enforcement. If there's a different, depending on how, I don't know if law enforcement needs to be in this, would need to be in this conversation from the beginning, but if there are potential, like we've talked at different points about notice to, and Sheriff, I'm totally blanking on some of those conversations, like essentially kind of adjusting the warrant where it's for certain types of cases where, so there's also a potential that law enforcement plays a bigger role or something about their current process or practice with how they serve warrants or serve notices to appear that are kind of sent to them, but I don't know that is necessarily a primary partner at the moment. But that would be another partner that I wouldn't want to not mention here.
This is Commissioner Reed. Thanks, Katie. I was just going to bring that up and feel like, yeah, maybe not right at the beginning, but if we identify some potential strategies to make sure we include some local law enforcement and how that would look practically speaking. Also just want to make the point on the work groups 2 and 3, the court specific folks. I think with the defense counsel, it's important to make sure we've got both misdemeanors and felonies, felony level representation as part of that, just because I know that, I mean, those can sometimes look different in terms of the reasons for failure to appear and what the warrants look like. And then back to the first work group, we were discussing that's more about improving court appearance rates. And I think maybe there's some thinking to be done. I think that list of people you mentioned as potential members is really strong. And maybe there's also some community organizations that have with some frequency attend court with clients or help give rides to clients to court, just to think through some of those strategies kind of from a social service lens, what that could look like and what resources might be available that court folks may not be aware of yet.
And then
Kate,
we-
Katie, my understanding is Shay Downing may have her hand
Yeah,
up.
yeah, I was about to call on her.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I didn't know if you could.
Do I
see
have to
that.
unmute her? No.
No, she could.
Do I need, okay, there she is.
Hi,
Jay.
yes, Shay Downey. I was just wondering if I understood the thought process to having these as two different work groups. My thought being, especially as it relates to municipal court in Lawrence and then the district court, if you have different ways of addressing those, it may become more complicated than it needs to be, because I know oftentimes you may have a client who doesn't appear for municipal court or district court or doesn't recognize which one of those they're supposed to be at. So having different reactions may actually be more harmful than helpful.
That's
I
a,
d-
that's a
yeah.
good point. I think that's something, maybe we can try to follow up with some feedback from municipal court judges and district court judges. I just also worry about each of their processes are separate, so it's, I don't know.
This is Commissioner Reed again. I appreciate that point, Shay. I think it's a strong one, and it's something I was thinking about when reading through the document ahead of today, that there's certainly differences in processes, both between the court processes and the prosecutor's office. But and DA Valdez, you can correct me if I'm wrong, think that there's some degree of, some communication between the DA's office, the district court and municipal court about cases that may get referred one way or the other. I don't know, but I have a similar feeling that a work group that's combined could be helpful in trying to identify some continuity of practices, so that it doesn't get too convoluted. And maybe the result of those discussions early on will be the processes are way too separate, or statutes are different for the types of charges at district court versus municipal court. And so maybe then we do need to separate, but I'm curious about other folks' feedback here on whether or not it makes sense to start that conversation kind of combined and bring all folks together. And at least for the sort of identifying what the current processes are might be helpful. And then perhaps there could be some division there.
So Suzanne Valdez here from the DA's office. I agree. I think maybe we should start, and then if it's necessary to splinter off, that might be important. One thing from our perspective is that, a defense, we deal with different defense attorneys, different ideas about how these things should be handled. We do not have a unified process from a defense perspective, which makes it, even though we can have a unified and policies that are streamlined, and we're looking at it from an institutional perspective on our end, from a prosecution perspective, the fact that we've got pretty much a bar that's the defense bar, that we do have the municipal defense group, but we don't have that formalized yet with felonies, which of course is our world. And hopefully that's coming, but one of the frustrations that I've expressed is, defense needs to file motions to modify all kinds of things that the state would be very willing to entertain. But we can't do that work. So while we can have a unified approach to how we go about handling these matters, having a unified, to the extent it's possible, defense perspective too, I think is helpful. And that's all to say that we'll participate however we can with the goals that we've stated. And I do agree that perhaps it may be very important for everyone to understand how it is, kind of what is our wheelhouse and what is our lane, So that if we go into different groups, if that's necessary at this point, people will understand where we're coming from. Because we can only do so much within our space, if that makes sense.
It could be too that that the tasks are kind of different underneath there, underneath that group. And so there's a group that kind of process maps municipal court, but then, and the same with district, but then at a joint meeting, they're kind of walking through and sharing, like it's one work group, but some of the tasks are maybe kind of splintered off when they're that focus. I do think that it makes, and this comes up in some of the other topics is, it can be different processes, but there's also a lot of benefit to sharing information and kind of having the same, having lots of folks at the same table to share ideas and resources and ideas or, information, stuff like that.
This
Then
is
Brad did.
Brad Finkel. I just throw this out there. And again, I think it's probably a difference because district court would have a much harder time than this. But I'm interested in having Lawrence look at an evening court session. I mean, when I was the Baldwin prosecutor, and I know Eudora has an evenings, it was always easier to get certain people to get to the evening. Harder to get attorneys there, but easier to get pro se clients there. And I'd be very interested in looking at that for Lawrence and how that might work. Harder for district court. Possible.
Right, well, and I agree. I think a night court we'd be willing to staff a night court. One of the things that we see is that people have jobs. And you have to have flexibility. The 8 to 5 model of how government works that's fine, but we would love to be able to staff a night court. But we have to have the courts willing to do it. But certainly we would be willing to do that as well, just to have flexibility for people to get their business done.
Then I wanted to, Shay, did you have your hand up again? Or I don't know if you wanted to add something, or Judge McCabery as well.
Yes, I did, but I didn't want to interrupt anyone, so.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, what I would say is two things. In Baldwin, we are going to hopefully start in the next couple of months, a night court every other month. We have to make sure that we have law enforcement who can be there, but I think that is expected to occur, just as an FYI. And to Prosecutor Valdez's, District Attorney Valdez's, point about defense counsel, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I do think there's also a lot of work that can be done with the current system that we have. Just like what we addressed with the previous bond issues and the praxis there, I think if there's an expectation of what's going to occur and everybody knows what that expectation is, it can be helpful to all defense counsel, regardless of who they are, if they know what the expected process is. So we can all advise our clients whether or not we have some decision from everybody who's going to be representing them about how it can be handled. If everyone knows how it's going to be handled at the end of the day, it can still be helpful in representing clients.
Thank you, Shay. Judge McCabery, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think that starting out with municipal and district courts together discussing the issue, and then if we need to diverge, we can figure that out. And I don't want to get ahead of the district court. I personally have thought night court's been a good idea for a long time, but there's a lot of logistical and staffing issues that go into it, but I'm happy to hear the discussion. So
I appreciate that.
Sheriff Armbruster here. Being somebody who's not an expert in the room when it comes to court systems and how it works, I had reached out to a judge about a no-show docket for district court, and I learned something that may be valuable for those of us who don't understand the system very well. We're all very well aware that municipal court, you can miss court and then you can show up later and get on the docket and have your warrant taken care of. And we all support that. But in district court, it's different, because once an attorney or once a client or a defendant has been assigned an attorney, the judge can no longer see that person in court without their attorney present. It is an impossibility to have represented counsel and then show up into a court in front of a judge and say, I need to get a new court date. I missed my date. He or she cannot even do that because they cannot work with you. Correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm speaking out of turn, but I think it's helpful for people to understand that there are certain limitations built within the system and the rights of the client and the defendant that won't allow us to do some of this work that I felt was super easy and low hanging fruit, but it turns out there are actually logistical and legal roadblocks in the way. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Judge McCabery.
Yeah, I would definitely say there are considerations. I never like to think of something as impossible. Sometimes that's the case. The other complicating factor for district court is in municipal court, you generally have one judge who's seen everybody who's there. And in district court, you have different judges assigned, different levels of cases. If one judge issues a failure to appear warrant, they may not feel comfortable with another judge handling a docket where they don't have the history of that case. They may not feel comfortable with an administrative way of dealing with it. So there's a lot of considerations to it. I just thought I'd add that for information.
Thank you, Judge.
This is, excuse me, Shannon Reed. This is the last thing I'll say about this topic. I think it was in your document, Katie, sort of one of the questions to prompt that I will just express some support for, which is I think a public warrants list would go a long way in our community in terms of public access to be able to view whether or not you have a warrant. So I appreciated that was included in this list and hope that that's a piece of the discussion in this work group going ahead.
That was some suggestions from the community to consider that. Other thoughts on this, or do we want to move forward and then like have larger discussion? How do y'all tell me? Okay. Okay, so that was kind of the end of failure to appear. The next one was thinking about probation violations. So I will say that part of we have the same conversation here as potentially we just did with failure to appear. District court, so we have 3 agencies that respond to probation in 3 primary agencies in the county. So we have community corrections, court services, both that respond to district court, probation clients, and then there are probation, mostly unsupervised probation from Lawrence Municipal Court, all of whom have the potential to end up in custody in the jail. And the challenge, as we talked about last month with this population, thinking about how they impact the jail, is this group tends to have a longer length of stay once they are booked into custody. So ideally, so I would just preface that we potentially are having the same consideration as this one large group that provides input and feedback on municipal court processes as well as district court responses to probation violations. Some of the starting points for these, whether it's 1 or 2 potential groups, thinking about better understanding kind of the types of violations that our probation staff are seeing. So particularly technical violations are not going to be something that we see that we can really kind of ferret out when we're looking at, oh, someone was booked into custody on a probation violation. So kind of understanding and so I rely a lot on the probation staff to kind of be able to inform what are those types of things that you're seeing. Is it a lot of new charges? That would be a different type of response potentially than a mass of technical violations. But then are there opportunities when we do have folks, again, similar to failure to appear, when they are booked into custody? Are there opportunities to reduce their length of stay, especially if it's a probation only or probation violation only booking? and opportunities to consider alternative sanctions, potentially like house arrest, while waiting after a probation violation has been served, but potentially prior to the probation violation hearing. In cases where that could be an appropriate response. I think a lot of the membership potentially is the same here as it is for the failure to appear folks as well. So the district attorney's office, again, a good representation of the defense counsel that are working with different levels of these clients, community corrections and court services staff, municipal court, whichever of their staff is kind of working on overseeing the probation, and then one of the other arms of CJS and Pam's group being potentially house arrest folks, if that's an option that the district or municipal court would want to consider. And I left off the district court judges, and that was not on purpose. That was very unintentional. So similar to these were, I think the length of stay for these folks had increased over time. I don't know that and I know that we do have the weekly in district court probation violation docket, which I think is really helpful to have that dedicated court space for these clients and their officers to be able to respond to violations. There's additional opportunities here that picking up on conversations that I think some of you guys may have already previously had. The benefit here, similar to failure to appear, to having one larger group where municipal court is included here is, again, I think there's opportunities to explore. It potentially is maybe more resource sharing, but also just information and support for any potential changes that either group of probation officers or programs might consider changing. Thoughts on this one? I don't.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
This is Susan Binkelman with Court Services. Did you say that the amount of time for probation violations in custody is going up?
It increased over the time that Vera's report looked at. It did, the median length of time in custody increased. What I don't know if they were able to really kind of suss out was which of those populations that might have been for.
Okay.
And I don't know that we've looked at the impact potentially of Judge Glover's docket because it's fairly new-ish.
My experience is the amount of time for probation violations has decreased dramatically. And so I guess I'd kind of want to see the numbers to see what types are staying for length. Pam, do you agree with me that they've gone down?
That's what we're assuming after the PV docket started, because people are being seen so much sooner than they were. The other thing we've been trying to work a lot on, trying to avoid the PV altogether, with the care coordination being embedded in for those folks that are criminal justice involved, to try and get them re-engaged, because that's typically what the PV is over, is lack of engagement in the service. But yeah, I mean, if we probably need to look at that data since the PV docket started to see if that impact is what we think it is.
No, I would say there potentially is a different impact between municipal and district court based on, I would imagine the reason for the violations are potentially very different, and the response to them or the expected way to kind of remedy those is likely very different among y'all's caseloads versus at least anecdotally what may be happening for the municipal court caseload. Chastity.
Yes, Chastity Shaper, peer support with DECA. As Shannon mentioned earlier, we partner some with community corrections and going to court hearings and such with people. I'd be interested to know what the numbers on the probation violations are, if they are substance related or mental health related. Because if it's substance abuse related and they're already in treatment, that could be a helpful piece in the probation violations to help steer them through the process or support them along the process and possibly help in those numbers of failure to appears. I know I personally have went to court with people several times. I've even worked closely with one of the corrections officers a few times.
I think understanding those levels of violations, would that be more of like, so Susan, I'm looking at you, and Pam, I'm also looking at you. Are those more of, you all would have to tell us kind of what those look like, right? I mean, we would need to
I
have your
would think-
staff pull that.
This is Susan Binkelman. I would think we would have the information on what led up to us filing a probation violation. I do know that both community corrections and court services, we work very hard to avoid filing those. But we do get to the point where, in order to enforce the orders of the court, which we are required by statute to do, that we do have to file those violations. So I do think that information can only come from the officers themselves.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot, as you all have already kind of talked about, to kind of unpack here, and around just better understanding kind of what this population looks like. And that really, I think, then drives what responses or what to kind of do with that. So I do think we have opportunity to, in this group, to really leverage our senior data analyst around kind of helping provide support for working with that data. But there will be some of that kind of staff component, Pam and Susan, for you guys to give some of that information.
It might be really helpful to have the data analyst also look at the data we're collecting to make sure we're actually capturing what would be helpful. Because we document to the end of the earth on stuff, but I don't know that we're getting the right information. So it might be for Matt to look at that, just to make sure we're capturing what he needs to know. So that would be helpful for this group moving forward.
Have other thoughts on this one?
This is Shannon Reed. I just have a question that maybe Susan or Pam have a quick answer to, specifically now that there's that PV docket at district court. And if somebody is notified that a probation violation has been filed on them, there's this opportunity to come to that docket to seek resolution. If they fail to appear at that, is there then the potential of that compounding factor of a failure to appear bench warrant being? I'm just curious if that's, because historically, I mean, we didn't have a docket. And as Sheriff Armbrister described, municipal court has a bit of a different process, but on a district court level, we didn't have a docket. So I'm just trying to think through if there's compounding factors where that becomes sort of an additional thing that person has to deal with on top of the probation violation, or if that's even a tool that you all have available post conviction in a situation like that.
If the probation, or if the person on probation has been reporting, then you would receive a notice to appear. If they have absconded and we have no contact with them at all, despite repeated text messages, phone calls, letters, then the only alternative is a warrant to get them in court so that we can move forward.
Pam, but I think that the district attorney's office does not charge for a failure to appear. It's not an additional charge that they're addressing.
That's correct. Under law, there's an independent charge for failure to appear. We have not charged that. Certainly in my 2 years, and I believe DA Branson at the time didn't either. So it's not, these are administrative in nature and not separate charges.
Moving on to the last few. We talked about jail review last time. The suggestion I had made or presented last month was to kind of potentially we table for a little bit, doing or developing an individual jail review process, but jail population reviews can also occur and be helpful for jurisdictions when they're looking at larger populations. So similar to what we saw a lot of in Vera's report, where they were looking at like what we've talked about. So folks who come into the jail on failure to appear, folks who come in on domestic violence, folks who come in on DWI, folks who are coming in on violent, person charges. So looking at where I think we have opportunity right now would be to tackle jail population review, looking at those larger kind of population specific drivers of jail population, potentially using FTA groups, the FTA only bookings and probation violations as kind of a starting point, and to update, essentially kind of updating data that we've looked at or that we've had to see kind of where we've changed, where things have changed, and then maybe that can become a starting point for moving forward after like kind of taking up next steps. I don't know that this, and what I included in the document that I had sent out last week, I don't know that this is necessarily a separate work group. I think the CJCC is the group for that. And so as we update, as data gets updated and as we work through kind of making progress or saying, oh, this new legislation came through or this change over here came through, then the CJCC could kind of direct, well, based on this, now what? And so that would be kind of the idea with that. We may potentially have the infrastructure and support later to revisit the individual level jail review process. I'm just not sure that this is a lot that I feel like I'm kind of throwing out for folks to consider, and that would be one that that I would suggest we could table.
This is Sarah. This is a topic that Katie and I have talked about quite a bit. And, I think it's also really hard for us to measure success in this space. Currently the jail shares information weekly. And we know stuff happens from it, but like to sort of be able to put a check mark next to that, name and say, this person's case was reviewed because of this report is probably not really, so it's a little difficult to monitor it, but I also want to stress to this group and to the public, this data is being shared, this information is being shared and reviewed by all the stakeholders in the system on a regular basis. One of the things that Katie and I have talked about is still trying to do kind of what we call the real deep dive into jail population several times a year, but that process is incredibly labor intensive from a jail data side and on behalf of the senior data analyst, and then also on the community, on the court criminal justice services side to marry up all the pieces of information on every individual person in the jail. So I still think we're going to do that. I still think that's something that we can share, but it's difficult to sort of, I kind of like this idea of like, let's see if we can capture bigger themes that are happening inside jail booking, and then explore that theme as opposed to just a group that gets together once a week with a list, if that makes sense.
And then the racial and ethnic disparities, I really want to toss this over to Sarah to discuss.
Well, I guess what I offered to help Katie kind of with this item. You know, I think we threw out last month an idea about changing how we look at the racial and ethnic disparities work group. And, you know, one of the things that we had thought about was embedding equity and inclusion impact, similar to equity. I think what do we call them in Unified Command? What was it? Equity Impact Advisors on each work group to sort of, not that that gets anyone on that work group off the hook with looking at issues involving racial and ethnic disparities, but creating some folks that are assigned to that sort of particular purpose. And then those folks could then also meet. So outside of that work group, they could also meet and have conversation to sort of what are they learning and hearing inside that process. So we didn't hear a whole lot of feedback on that topic between the last meeting and this one. So we wanted to sort of throw that out there and see how the group felt. Okay. Yeah. And I think that, that still means that I think we're still going to have conversations, I think Katie may be getting to this later, obviously law enforcement stop data is still being collected, still going to be reviewed. Chiefs have committed to doing that twice a year. Also, what was the other thing I was going to mention about that? I can't remember, but, training and offering implicit bias and other types of training. I think that's still something that CJCC has been sort of a champion for community-based training on some of those topics in the past. I know many organizations already do it. So I think that's something that we can kind of monitor and study is if there's a need for additional training, that would be helpful to have the county get a contract and be offered in multiple places. Like that's something we're certainly open to involving implicit bias and other areas of study. So those were kind of the two areas that committee sort of owned in the past that I think will continue to do just as a part of our normal work.
This is Shannon Reed. I'm interested. We saw some head nods, positive, agreeable head nods in the room for the folks that are on Zoom. But anybody who is part of the sort of historical racial and ethnic disparities work group that's here in this meeting, if you all have any feedback about that thought process, we definitely want to hear it. Otherwise, I'll just assume everybody agrees with us.
I'm not in the group, but I do. Just my comment on it would be not only to have them present, but each of these work groups should have some goals that are oriented around infusing that equity and inclusion. I mean, I think that should be something that is marked on every single one of these work groups, or how are we keeping that as kind of the overarching theme? And I think that certainly that work group can help, figure out what that wording is, what those goals are. But I think if it's a achievable and measurable goal that we can insert into these work groups, that is going to do more than just having, I fear in equity and inclusion, just having somebody there just to be there, but rather having them kind of be that oversight and really see how we can improve upon that within these groups.
I think that's great feedback.
We're going to continue to obviously monitor race, ethnicity, everything and all the data. As we review each alternative every year, we look at that data. So that's always forefront for us, looking at that as we serve the groups that we serve to make sure that we're not doing anything with any disparity. We want to offer those programs to the same groups, to everyone in this community that's eligible for it. So I want to just reiterate that we'll continue to look at that data always, and this group will be presenting it to the CJCCs as we update the information.
You want to just take this one?
This is Bob Triansky. I have one thought around that, and That is that as we've looked at this, I think some issues, and I'll give you some examples. So if you look at the racial disparities related to referrals to drug court with the number of clients that have accepted, length of stay among the incompetent, or not the incompetent, the competency restoration process, I feel like there's some opportunity now, given the data we've collected and reviewed, to maybe pull some things together thematically. And then to build on what Marielle's saying is, what should our aspiration or goal be in terms of what we want to now analyze, what we want to understand, and can some targeted goals emerge from that? I feel like we have a lot of data around this issue, but sort of like, where are these issues sort of elevating several themes? I think we see some similar things in the behavioral health space, and I think we really need to understand not just national trends or state trends around these issues, but what happens in Douglas County and what happens in the facilities we're responsible for.
And this is Marielle again. I agree. I think we have the data, we're seeing the disparities, but it's that next step that we need to figure out, because if we're going to continue seeing these trends, and we're continue seeing these disparities, how can we, and we look at it and from a social service standpoint as well, what are we needing to do to improve upon those, and how can we be creative in those spaces? And I think that particular work group has that opportunity, since it isn't as measurable. Sometimes it's more of a subjective, let's be creative here, let's try some things. I'm really appreciative that the data is out there, because it does paint a picture of what our community is at right now. But I see it and then kind of hear from the clients that I work with that we're still having these barriers. And so I think this group is more than appropriate to start seeing where those gaps are. And I think these work groups in particular, I'm really excited to see how access to resource can be a priority in a lot of these things, because I see it in failure to appear. I see it in probation violations. A lot of those are the socioeconomic barriers that sometimes don't get accounted for. We can, be as available as possible, but if there is a barrier within that individual's life, then, we can't meet that need. So how do we do that?
We do have Chuck online. He has his hand raised. Chuck, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very happy to hear Bob Transky's perspective on this. And it reminds me of a kind of fundamental point about our processes in the CJCC from the start. From the very start, there was a strong commitment to addressing the issues of behavioral mental health. And in the end, of course, the county hired a coordinator, Bob, to head up those efforts. And it's very clear that having a staff member assigned specifically to deal with those issues really deepened our understanding of the questions and deepened our sense of what kinds of solutions might be appropriate. And I think we ought to take some lessons from that experience for this question, that is the racial and ethnic disparities question, in that here we have a work group assigned to addressing that's the second major priority of the CJCC, but we don't really have a staffer assigned specifically to it. And the one thing that I do fear, if we were to diffuse responsibility for that area to just one individual representative across a bunch of different areas, we might lose focus and focused attention on how to address it. So I think it's really essential at a bare minimum that we keep something like the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Work Group going to keep a sort of a focused attention on the issue. And I would suggest that we think, about whether we want to, in the future, consider some way of giving as much priority to this really important issue as we have to the behavioral mental health issue over time. And that would, I think, require some kind of professional staff assignment to really digging into the issue. I really have valued Matt's contribution, Matt Cravens' contribution on the data side to this. But Matt has a much broader set of responsibilities than just addressing the racial and ethnic disparities issue. So, to sum up, my point would be I'm perfectly comfortable having an individual member of each various group assigned to raise this issue. But I fear that that can end up diffusing attention to the issue. We still need to have some sort of focused attention to it and agenda on it. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Shay put a couple things in the chat, but I can't read them. So Shay, I don't know if it was about implicit bias training, I think. So she, what Shay added was implicit bias training should be a regular event. I've attended several sessions and have learned something every time. So there's another support, and that would be one of my recommendations, as well as thinking about how do we engage regular implicit bias, make available some level of on a regular basis implicit bias training for our agencies and staff.
Chuck, I appreciate your comments. I guess I'd like to kind of ask a little bit more. If those impact advisors are working on different work groups, and bringing that information back to each other. So I envision that as more than one person, at least one per work group, if not more. If I guess I'm trying to also be sensitive if the racial and ethnic disparities work group, which I have some concerns because we don't have a lot of representation from CJCC members on that. So to me, it's one of those things that if it's important to us, we should show up. And I'm looking at this table. So if it's one of those things that we want to keep that group going, I want to be really clear as to its purpose and the work ahead of it. If we're going to keep that group going. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more, Chuck, about what you're thinking that, that specific emphasis would be, and what would be their charge.
Sure. So I would, again, I want to preface these comments with just a broader observation about where we've come and where we seem to be going in the CJCC. When I joined, and this is just a few months after the CJCC was started, it was my understanding that there were two broad missions for the CJCC. One was to help address behavioral and mental health issues in the various processes that we deal with. And the other was to begin thinking about how to address racial and ethnic disparities in these various processes. And over time, we've done, in my view, remarkably well in addressing the first. We have and of course, there are some limits to progress on that, but we've made a lot of progress. We have a coordinator working on that. We've put a substantial amount of resources into developing a behavioral mental health campus, and I understand and I'm not doubting the issues with getting that working in a real way. But that's real progress. On the other side, we have a work group composed mostly of volunteers. And we've made some progress on gathering statistics in that area. But we have, I think in some ways, your question is exactly right on. We've lacked some focus about where we're going and what we're doing. And in part, I think it is just a reflection of this is sort of a second priority and not a top priority for the CJCC. And I would hope that we could put the time and resources and perhaps staff energy into this second area in the way that we have to the first. Now, you ask a fair question. What do I think we ought to do? I think in the end, we ought to keep our eye on the ball. And in my perspective, that is disparities in outcomes. How are people faring in the end, in the process? And try to, if we see real disparities in those outcomes, and we do, we ought to really dig into why that is and what we can do about it. And I recognize that this is a set of issues that goes beyond criminal justice processes, but that's true as well of behavioral mental health too. And again, I'll stop there. I'm happy to continue the conversation. Those are my thoughts at this point in the process on it. And thank you.
Yeah, I'm not, I guess thoughts from others, I guess, you know, we're really trying to figure out how you want us to do this. And you know, yeah, I want to make sure we're hearing from.
This is Maria Ligon. Would it be a possibility to begin looking at it in the way that we did structure mental and behavioral health? And how, just maybe looking back at how we started those initiatives, we obviously gained a staff member for that. I don't know logistically if that's more difficult, but I do agree with Chuck. If we have a group of mostly volunteers and staff, it would be opportunistic of us to have a dedicated staff member to help maybe prioritize some things. And you know, not to compare behavioral health and racial and ethnic disparities, but they do intersect incredibly. And I think if we can look at the framework and the success that we've done on one side, what can we mirror to start looking at what we have now and how we move forward?
Yeah, and I guess just as a little bit of context, like the county's decision to add a director of behavioral health projects really was not an outgrowth of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. Kind of came as separate conversations related to you know, initiatives involving an additional property tax that was added for behavioral health issues, and then also the sales tax. So it wasn't, and obviously Bob's work isn't limited to criminal justice under any stretch of the imagination. Obviously I work at the pleasure of the county commission to put forward what they want to have put forward from a county perspective. I would say, you know, when I've been asked this question as the county administrator, I've resisted the notion of hiring a specific staff person for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think it's everyone's job. And so I don't really want to just give it to one person and say it's their job to be in charge of those issues. But that being said, you know, obviously it's if the county, I don't have the resources today to add a criminal, a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, you know, I don't know if that's something we want to, in terms of assigning staff resources, I don't have those available today to dedicate to this work.
Go ahead.
You have to push it up at someone help Matt there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. I've just been on the racial disparities group for the last few years, so I thought I'd add a little perspective. I like Chuck's comment. But one thing I'll say is possible directions is to analyze racial disparities at each decision point. That's what we were doing before things sort of, you know, slowed down last summer, but we were sort of looking at each decision point, sort of, you know, pre-trial sentencing, plea bargaining and so forth. And we were sort of taking a meeting to analyze each one of those. And that's certainly a possibility for future meetings if people want to do that.
This is Pam. I think it would be interesting if we not consider necessarily having a professional person, but partnering with an organization that this is what they do is for a living. Something like the Burns Institute. There's a bunch of different organizations that do this work in this environment, especially since we're talking about criminal justice. But I think having been in racial disparity since the beginning, that work group, we do a lot of data analysis, but we don't do a lot about what do we do next? What's the next step to fixing this problem? But that would be my suggestions, that maybe we partner with an organization that does this for a living.
I'd like that.
Sometimes you'd be right into it.
Yeah. All right, Patrick Schmitz.
I think when we talked about this last month, the idea was to possibly bring some of that work back to this table instead of keeping them separate, which is what I'm definitely supportive. And I know for me, the challenge in regularly attending that group, which I am a member, is the calendar has switched and it conflicts with something. So it's a choice between two things, and it's been very challenging. And so
And I think that's a great point about bringing it back to this group. So I think like if particularly if what Matt's talking about in terms of that data point, there's no reason why that can just come to the whole CJCC as opposed to a specific work group. Because I guess I would say if we're going to have the work group, I want to make sure that, you know, CJCC is invested in that work group.
This is Mariel again. I think I do see looking at those data points is important, but building and setting those goals within a meeting once a month that has other presentations, other business that we have to attend to. I think if this truly was a priority when we started, maintaining it in a work group and really focusing on setting something strategically, what we can achieve, that needs to be separate, in my opinion. Just so we're focused on that content and ensuring the progress throughout it, just as we would with any other work group. I see the importance in having it separate, just so it can be a priority. But I also see, as you said, we all have stake in this, reviewing it as this group, and maybe just looking over again, just reviewing meeting times. Maybe it's as simple as that, is reassessing folks' commitment to it.
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting concept. I think, also, we don't have a specific work group on behavioral health and criminal justice. We infuse that work throughout our work. And we created a number of initiatives involving that. I think that's kind of how we did the law enforcement contact study was, it was something this whole group talked about. It wasn't specifically assigned to one particular work group. I think your notion of goals is really interesting, and maybe that's something that I know that I think Katie and I would really benefit from, is hearing from CJCC members, what specific goals do you think we should be working on in this area? What particular data points, what particular initiatives, what particular areas of focus do you see? And, maybe it's something that, you could think about, email to us, and before our May meeting, we have more conversation about, because I guess I want to see the goal and then design the process to fit the work, as opposed to let's just keep a committee and, put a square peg in a round hole, if that's not what the right process is to do it. But obviously I'm really interested in the thoughts of others here.
This is Shannon Reed, and this conversation has been helpful, so I appreciate everybody's thoughts about it. I think, maybe there is some opportunity to really strengthen what that work group is and, rework it a little bit. But since there has been such a focus on looking at data at different decision points, that the opportunity is for that group to be able to help identify some potential goals or areas to create goals around based on those different decision points and data that they're assessing, that can be a little bit more tangible. And then maybe, I think that's an important conversation for us as a whole group to continue having in our regular CJCC meetings, but also the opportunity exists for that group to maybe disperse into the other groups, maybe not on a constant basis, but semi-regular, and be able to provide some sort of help provide the data and be of support in identifying what those disparities are with regards to failure to appear or probation violation or jail review, each of those work groups. So maybe that group can sort of stay intact, but be a little bit refreshed and refocused on helping identify what some of those goals are, and then supporting the other work groups in moving forward on some tangible progress towards eliminating those disparities.
This is Bob Tryansky again. One thought that occurs to me is to the degree that we've made good progress as behavioral health partners working in the behavioral health space, I would share with you that I think one thing that we've learned is that it's not merely enough to convene high-level leadership like sits at this table. The next question you need to ask is, how do you staff and support the ongoing conversation that need to happen? And then the tasks that need to be broken down if you're going to actually accomplish the goal. So it may be that this group kind of needs to look at itself and say, what other resource or existing staffing or capacity can we bring to the table to pull data together? And then, and then bring in the outside technical assistance to help synthesize it, to help make some recommendations. I mean, I think an example of this is what we've done with the supportive housing needs assessment, and that work group is not staffed by members of the Behavioral Health Leadership Coalition, right? That's staffed by folks that are implementing these housing programs and having the opportunity to talk about where the barriers are and where the real work is. So I think some organization I think there's things we could learn from where we've had success in public health and the behavioral health space.
So do we, thinking about action steps, should we, at least try to think about if this group can sort of help think about this specifically and sort of give thoughts as to like what those goals and area and focus could be? And between now and May, and then maybe staff could bring back some options or some things to react to. Plus the data, some conversations around data and what the, Chuck and some of your thoughts as to what the specific areas of focus might be. Chuck.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think Bob's suggestions for really particular ways forward are really great. And I think some ways that was the direction we were heading in, as Matt was saying, as of last August. Although we hadn't yet gotten to the point of identifying staffing contributions to that. But yes, I think I endorse that suggestion. So thank you.
So I'm thinking about time. Next steps. Yeah, I was just going to kind of fast forward. Thinking about are these the proposals or the thoughts around like failure to appear, like the work group, do those seem agreeable to folks, or is that good?
Say for folks on Zoom again, we see lots of affirmative head nods in the room and thumbs up from Shay. Thank you for that. I wonder, Katie, and this is just a suggestion that in the next couple of weeks, if people in this room in CJCC can identify which group they are personally interested in, but also what other staff or folks in their departments that they think would be, we heard a little bit about that from DA Valdez so I know some of those thoughts are already going on, but trying to figure out who the appropriate people are to start and get these off the ground, that seems helpful and maybe not possible to do in the last 5 minutes of our meeting, but if everybody can identify which group they think it makes most sense for them to sit on or provide staff support to.
Are folks all right with that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. For the last couple of things that I was thinking I wanted to throw out for consideration for our May meeting agenda. Judge McCabery had to hop off, so I will have to circle back with him about the potential. I feel like it would be helpful for us to for this group to get a presentation or an introduction to our self-help center director. I think in May might be a good time as she's kind of getting up and going. So I was going to check with the judge about whether that might be available for us to consider. Work group updates by then, which may just be, we've had a couple meetings or we've we've got the people and we've got meetings scheduled, but at least to kind of circle back on these couple topics. Having this group revisit and kind of circle back to the conversation about racial and ethnic disparities, and how we, like the feedback that we've received, or continuing the conversation that we've started today. If that seems like a doable agenda.
I think that sounds great. This is
Okay.
Pam. I wondered if we could add the house arrest data review maybe with the CJCC for May. Will we be done? So if it's time permitting,
then
if there's some time
yes.
for a review of those things, it'd be great.
I don't have any folks on Zoom have their hand raised, but we do have about 5 minutes.
Yep, this should be time for public comment. So if anybody has, anybody in the room or anybody on Zoom has anything they want to comment on. now's
Yeah,
the-
so we have 2 public comments. I believe Rick had his hand up first. I'm gonna allow him to talk.
Great, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you much. I just have 3 things. I'm going to mention them. If you want to respond, fine. Otherwise, I'd be happy to hear from you or Katie about this. But you've taken a big bite and got a lot of things on your plate. That's commendable. I just want to make sure that in a more thorough review of the Vera report, that other recommendations that have not been a part of your discussion today might show up as a kind of a footnote for consideration later. We can't do everything in the first year, but I think if we look at that report thoroughly, we'll find some other recommendations that are not yet on your agenda. The second thing would be related to the work groups that you're discussing. What are the possibilities for public participation? Pam made quick mention of this with regard to one of them. So I think there's some benefit in several cases of having representatives of the public. And finally, a topic that I've been conversing with DA Valdez about has to do with competency to stand trial. Certainly, there are individuals taking up space in the jail. That part of the population could be reduced if we had better mechanisms to deal with competency evaluation and restoration. So I hope that this issue will be a part of your discussion even in this first year. Thank you.
Did you want to respond to their comment?
I can follow up out separately with Rick.
Yeah, just real quick on Rick's comment about competency restoration. Yeah, I share his, some of his concerns, all of his concerns. I think they're everyone's concerns. And so I have been working with the Kansas commissioner on behavioral services, health services. And he and I met last week. So there's more on this. Just wanted to let you know that I'm already working on it from my angle, and have reached out to some stakeholders to see if we can get a conversation going. And this is all in conjunction also with the TRC and operation of that. But there's just pieces that I think we can start having conversations about, and certainly I'm willing to do that.
Rick, are you gonna, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Zana, you want to admit the other person?
Yes, I'm going to allow Jolene to speak.
Great, thank you. Jolene, go ahead. Jolene.
Okay, thank you. I'm one of the dedicated volunteers on the racial disparities work group. I've been a member since November 2019. And I appreciate what Chuck and Pam had to say. I have been frustrated. The collection of data has been wonderful. The discussion of that data has been very good. Some of it has been quite concerning to me, but in these 2.5 years, the outcomes have pretty much remained the same in many categories. So I do appreciate the committee. I would like the work group. I would like to see it continue. I would like us to be able to define problems and recommend action steps. And also, I agree with the last speaker. I think it's very important in these work groups to have dedicated volunteer community members, because it just makes the community more a part and aware of what's going on. That's all.
Thank you, Jolene. Do we have anybody from the public today that wants to make a comment? Anybody else on the online?
No.
Great. Do we have anything else for the good of the order today? Seeing that no one has any suggestions, this meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting of CJCC is May 9th, 2023. See you then.